right. Yes, welcome everyone to another episode of our English version of Daanish TV. Today we're incredibly delighted to have a very good friend and one of the most brilliant investigative journalists we have out there today. Max Blumenthal is his name. And the work that he has been doing over the past many years has just been utterly inspirational for many of us who have been attempting to challenge the formidable hegemony of mainstream media, mainstream propaganda on a whole array of issues. And the quality of my dear friend Max is that it's incredible the way that he kind of unpacks wherever he sees some type of propaganda emanating from, say, Western mainstream media or any other source, he immediately attacks it and unpacks it and deconstructs it and rips it to shreds. And it's amazing what he does. He's the founder of the Gray Zone Project. I've had the privilege of writing for it myself. He's written books on. He's written a book, very famous book on Israel and Palestine, a documentary on Gaza. His latest book, The Management of Savagery, an incredible book outlining many of the issues over the past, few decades, demonstrating how the United States has effectively created through its proxy forces, through its direct interventionism, now leading up to this era of hybrid warfare, all of these myriad problems that it says that it wants to confront, now that it supposedly then is in bed with and supports, and so on and so forth. Now, I can speak at length because I just absolutely am in love with Max's work. But of course, we are here to have Max speak about the work that he's done and the kind of what I really wanted to focus on, the situation going on in the world today. What in Max Blumenthal's analysis is kind of what the United States, where he's based, what type of kind of policies it's undertaking, particularly with regard to the Middle East and Palestine, an area which is very near and dear to Max's heart, also in Latin America. Beyond that, I also want to come back to the question of what is going on in America itself. I think that we would not have anyone better to actually give us a lot of insights into that very cumbersome issue of American political culture today. So, Max, welcome to our show. Really happy to have you on, and I hope you can hear me.
I hear you loud and clear. Thank you for that really warm intro, Junaid, and thank you for all the important work you're doing. I guess we met when I reached out to you because of my familiarity with your work to get some insights for my book, The Management of Savagery. So it's nice to finally join you in virtual person.
No, thanks for that. Absolutely. And I wanted to also mention that it's amazing to always listen to Max and his interviews. I mean, his writing is just absolutely phenomenal, but it's very rare where you get such a brilliant writer with who also speaks in such a way that is so politically sharp on the one hand, but also has a twist of humor that that makes you want to listen to it again and again and again. So hopefully we can have some of that, a taste of that in this interview as well. I'm not sure if people will get some of the references you refer to, but I'll enjoy myself. So, Max, let's start off. I think that many people here, and in fact, I just came back from an interview, and we were speaking about our Prime Minister, the Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan's speech at the virtually for the UN General Assembly, in which one of the interesting things that he pointed out was his uncompromising position, unlike many other Muslim Zionist regimes that we know now, on the question of Palestine. And I think it was directly in response to the fear, the anxiety amongst many people within the Muslim lands, Muslims, Christians, Jews, whoever, that what is going on? One Muslim regime after the next, although it's not many right now, it's 2 or 3, are beginning to normalize relations with Israel and so on and so forth. So I think our prime minister really responded to that and by saying that no, there's no way in heck that we're going to do this, that until the suffering and the brutality and oppression, continues of the Palestinians, there's no way we will recognize Israel. So what I wanted you to, it's a good way to actually ask you to kind of speak about what has happened now in this kind of this deal of the century that is concocted by these parties, the United States, the UAEs now recognizing Israel, and now it's gotten Bahrain on its to do so as well, and the Saudis. So I think, particularly for our audience, a Pakistani audience, a Muslim audience, and so on, it would be really good to get kind of your perspective on what has led up to these developments and what do these developments represent.
I mean, on a broad scale, you can look at these developments, and I think you're specifically referring to the warm peace treaty between the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel as really the fulfillment or apotheosis of colonialism, of colonial states that have been carved into the Middle East, making peace with one another in the public that has been in effect for decades in private, and
That's right.
catering to their, basically playing the role of Trump's apprentices, catering to the president and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who is guiding this policy. So you mentioned the UN General Assembly, which wasn't followed as closely as usual this year because it was virtual. But anyone who wanted to express their fealty, not to the United States, but to Trump, would have praised this peace deal. And anyone who was concerned about this peace deal actually being a war party, as Imran Khan rightly was, would speak out against it. We even heard the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, express solidarity to the Palestinians and call for a two-state solution, which was a jab at Donald Trump. And what Trump has done is something remarkable. And first of all, in authorizing the deal of the century, which, Palestinians correctly call the steal of the century. And the deal of the century basically destroys the Palestinian question. It explodes the Palestinian question or the Palestinian issue and settles it once and for all. The status quo in the United States, in Washington, had been to continuously allow Israel to negotiate and sit at the bargaining table with a puppet kind of Vichy-style government in Ramallah and the Palestinian Authority. And meanwhile, offering no borders, no final status proposals, and to continue to put facts on the ground in the form of mega settlements which surround Jerusalem. I've spent many, many months in the West Bank, maybe years. And every time I go back, Jerusalem is more and more surrounded to the point where there could be no viable Palestinian capital there. And that's the product of the peace process. That is the product of Oslo. And what Trump has done through his son-in-law, who I'll talk about in a second, is just ripped up the fraud of the peace process, said this is one state, everything belongs to Israel, and the Palestinians can get their little Bantustans. They have been defeated. And we're just bringing that all out into the open, which means that it's apartheid. No one can deny it anymore. It's one state. The majority of the population is Palestinian. It's an apartheid state. That is the achievement of Donald Trump. And in many respects, advocates of Palestinians having equal rights should thank for that, for ripping the mask off of the fraud of the peace process. And it's thanks
Absolutely.
and it's thanks to the forces behind Trump. Donald Trump, when he first started campaigning for president in 2015, actually talked about his desire for a two-state solution. And he talked about, wanting to make a deal like he tried to do in Korea between the North and the South. He wanted a Nobel Prize. In comes Sheldon Adelson. Sheldon Adelson controls several casinos through his Las Vegas Sands Corporation. He is one of the richest men in the world. His issue is Israel. He cares about nothing else. He has an Israeli wife, and he's bought a large part of the Israel lobby, and he proceeded to dump money into the Trump organization, into Trump's campaign. He's spent in this election cycle $50 million on Republican Senate races. And Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, his family is very much like Sheldon Adelson. They were ultra-Zionists. They ran a foundation that supported the settlements in the West Bank. And he married the president's daughter. He gets the security clearances. He guards access to the presidents. The generals from the Pentagon have to go through Jared Kushner, this kid who's just like the son of a slumlord, in order to get to the president. And so he authorizes, along with Sheldon Adelson.
He's MBS's best friend. Yeah.
Right. And
on WhatsApp.
It was reported that Jared Kushner helped provide Katani, MBS's digital henchman, with a list of Saudi traders from U.S. intelligence or people who are working against MBS's interests. So, I mean, Kushner was trying to ink this deal, this regional deal, to make the deal of the century possible. And so when the UAE comes to the bargaining table, the UAE, a colonial carve-out whose population represents what, like 0.0006% of the population of Muslims in the world, and none of them can vote, none of them have a say. It's a permanent monarchy.
Absolutely.
So
right, and in which way more than half of the population are basically migrant laborers without any rights whatsoever. So, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you've been to any of the Gulf countries, but the few days I've spent there, it's like the only people you meet in the streets are migrant laborers, and then you just go from hotel to hotel to hotel.
Yeah.
Meeting.
And in some ways, Max, I mean, this is what I say, that in some ways it is precisely states like these that can actually engage in this type of normalization process with Israel. These police states that have absolutely no accountability towards their people, they are the ones that can actually supposedly get away with this.
Right. I mean, they don't have to answer to any Muslim population. So there's no civil society. So it made sense. And the way they sold the deal to the rest of the world was that, this was a win-win, and it would help the Palestinians because annexation which Trump put on the table in order to twist the arm of the Palestinians and everyone else, would be stopped. In exchange, the UAE would get the US F-35 jet. I don't know why everyone wants that jet, because it can barely fly, but it's kind of a way of, they never come out of the box. It's like when you buy the Russian S-400, it's just a way of saying, like, we're on board with one of the powerful countries. So, and, so just this week, Netanyahu announced 20,000 new settlement units in the West Bank. It just shows the whole thing was just a fraud. They were never going to stop annexation. It's going ahead, but it's going ahead under cover of a new peace treaty with the Palestinians really under the control of a Palestinian Authority that has never been weaker, because the Trump administration has been continually defunding it. While
absolutely, and so these supposedly peace treaties that Israel is undertaking with countries that it has never actually been at war with, the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain. I mean, that in itself is just such a fraud to actually even call these peace treaties, because these are, as you were mentioning, these are countries, including Saudi Arabia, with which Israel has had close ties for quite a while now. So to call it peace treaties is kind of quite a joke.
Yeah,
in
well,
that
I mean,
sense.
I think it's a war party because these are the countries that are aligning together against Iran, and they say Iran has
Right.
brought us together, and that's what I think the fear of a regional war is very real.
Yeah, and in fact, Max, I'd like you to actually elaborate on that. I mean, the question of Iran, how that fits into all of this right now. So that's key, I think.
Well, the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy was also a tip of the hat to Trump's largest single individual donor, Sheldon Adelson. And, just for viewers, it's important to note that Donald Trump, he plays the role of the rich man, but as his tax returns showed, they just appeared yesterday, he's not really that wealthy. And he's incurred huge losses over the years. So Sheldon Adelson's money is important to Trump in his operation. And
Mhm.
Adelson and two other billionaires, pro-Israel billionaires, Bernard Marcus and Paul Singer, they fund the whole anti-Iran lobby in Washington, along with anti-Iran politicians like Tom Cotton and Marco Rubio, who are the two loudest voices for attacking Iran militarily in Washington. And why do they
Mhm.
want to attack Iran? Because Iran is the proud sponsor of the resistance axis, which extends through Syria, through Iraq, and into southern Lebanon with Hezbollah, which Israel has been unable to defeat and will be unable to defeat. And
So,
so,
so it's not because of that Iran is not a democracy or it's a theocracy and that it has bad human rights record. That's
right,
not
I
the
mean,
reason why.
this is the language of Mike Pompeo, and it's very ironic to hear Mike Pompeo say, the Secretary of State to say Iran executes gays, Iran treats women poorly, and yeah,
Right.
Iran does have a troubling human rights record. But Mike Pompeo
Yes.
is a figure who is himself anti-gay, who has
Right.
advocated against policies for women's reproductive rights in the U.S. He's affiliated with the extreme Christian right. So
Right.
his human rights language is just cynical. And
Not to mention it, the other allies they have in the region right next to Iran. Right. So,
exactly. I mean, yeah, I don't know how many people were beheaded in Saudi Arabia, but
right.
they were consistently beating out ISIS when ISIS was at its high point, and
Right.
quite an achievement. They should, I don't know, they should. It's too bad they don't have an Olympic sport for beheading, because then the Saudis would maybe win a medal. Um,
Right. Right. Right.
but this is our friend. We love them. We love
Yeah.
when they bomb a school bus full of Yemeni kids. It's everyone just gets really quiet in Washington. They're like, if only that had been a Russian jet, they would say something. So yeah, you make a
Right.
good point. But the real issue is Israel, and Israel is now aligning itself with these Gulf states in preparation for some kind of regional war that they themselves can't fight. Um, I don't think Israel can fight it for a number of reasons. Tactically,
Mm.
because Israel's Air Force cannot, it would need in-air refueling or landing rights somewhere in somewhere like Azerbaijan in order to reach Iran. Beyond that, Israeli society is not strong enough to withstand another attack from Hezbollah that could see large parts of the northern city of Haifa on fire. We've even
Right.
seen
Yeah, and I think Max, that's what many of I think our viewers would be interested in. Your own kind of deep assessment, very quickly, deep assessment very quickly of kind of what's going on in Israeli society itself. Has it moved so far to the right that it can't understand what's going on vis-a-vis the occupied territories, vis-a-vis kind of within the region, its own survival for the long run. So a quick kind of, just because I know your research has been so extensive and your visits here, I think people would really love to hear that perspective from you on what is the nature of Israeli society today.
Well, I haven't been since 2018. I spent an enormous amount of time there at at a pivotal period when Netanyahu was consolidating himself as King Bibi. And this was the result of generations of conditioning and indoctrination. That was really the thesis of my book, Goliath, which paints a portrait of Israeli society under permanent right-wing control. And when I say indoctrination and conditioning, this takes place in two institutions. The Israeli school system, in which students learn that Israel is everything between the river and the sea, and that Palestinians don't really exist except as a sort of Bedouin nomadic people or as terrorists. And the second institution is the military, where all Israelis, male and female, have to conscript. And it's in the military where these racist attitudes really take root, and where there's, it's important to note that Israel's military doesn't need full conscription. They don't need everyone to be a part of it. They could even have a professional army like the United States, with all of the technology they have in drone warfare and these advanced weapons platforms, and they would lose nothing. They do conscription in order to build their society and to construct the Zionist mindset, which is ruthless and sees any compromise as tantamount to not only sort of national defeat, but a genocidal extinction of the Jewish people. And they actually are, you learn to believe in the military that you are fighting for the survival of Jews internationally. And that puts a huge weight on your shoulders. I wrote in my book about how 25% of Israeli high school students leading up to their military service are sent by the Ministry of Education to Auschwitz to go to these sites of Jewish extermination during the genocide committed by Nazi Germany and its allies. And that they come back, the Ministry of Education polls their attitudes, and they come back with attitudes that are more strongly in support of a Jewish state and more hostile to Palestinians and Iranians and the enemies of Israel. And then they go to the military
as if they were responsible for the Holocaust, right?
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
Exactly.
Right.
And I mean, that is an important part of what I would call Netanyahu's Holocaust revisionism, which is to transplant blame for the Holocaust onto Palestinian leadership. And so he constantly talks about the Palestinian mufti, the first mufti of Jerusalem, being in league with Hitler and actually responsible for overseeing the final solution, which is, I mean, at best he was a bit player, but he also, within Palestinian life, he was only one figure on the Arab Higher Committee. I mean, so it's ridiculous, but this is what you hear constantly. The Holocaust is such a major part of Israeli life. And that is the result of that is that when you look at these polls that are taken of Israeli youth by the Israel Democracy Institute, which is a nonprofit based in Israel that does these nonpartisan polls, you see that consistently over 50% of young Israelis say they would not want to go to school with an Arab. They would not want to live next door to an Arab, and that they favor the mass expulsion of Palestinians from 1948 Israel. And that's the result of the way that Zionist society has been constructed. And it's led to real destabilization.
And Max, the peace movement, any large scale peace movement in Israeli society today, or?
Well, what I found when I was there, were that the Jewish Israelis I was able to, be around for long periods of time without having really ugly arguments, were radical anarchists. And they number in the hundreds. They are the most marginalized group in Israeli society who are Jewish. Many of them resist army service by going to jail. There was one person named Natan Blanc who did something like 5 jail terms rather than serve in the army. And they all have their army stories. And their army stories are prison stories.
Right.
and that's the peace movement in my view. Some of them formed a group called Anarchists Against the Wall, and I would go into the West Bank with them, and I would see them day after day, but usually every Friday, go into a village that Israel was building the separation wall through, stealing land from farmers. The village had organized a resistance where they'd go out and protest non-violently, or they'd throw rocks at soldiers who were armed with, these advanced Tavor rifles and stun grenades and so on. And the anarchists would join with these Palestinians, or they would put their bodies between the soldiers and the Palestinians. And, it was a moving display, and they would get arrested left and right. One of their, they say they have no leaders, but they did. And one of their leaders was jailed for several months, I believe last year, Yonatan Pollock. And then what passes for the Israeli peace movement is really what's left of the old labor Zionist movement, which doesn't favor peace in any way that we understand it. What they favor is hard separation from the Palestinians on demographic lines. And so it's that labor Zionist movement represented by Yitzhak Rabin, or more recently Ehud Barak, that set the stage for the siege of Gaza. They started putting the first barriers around Gaza, electric fences and stone barriers. They were the ones who conceived the idea of a separation wall. And they said, we'll give you a little quasi-state. We don't want to see you. We don't want you to exist. And then we'll call it peace. Meanwhile, you have the Likud faction that's like, we just want it all, and we'll live among you and you'll be our subjects.
Right. No, thanks for that, Max. I think that many of us really don't know the internal dynamics. I went to Palestine and Israel once in 2007, and the psychological intimidation one faces just at the airport. It was quite dumb of me to go through Tel Aviv rather than through Amman, but that one faces going there and coming out. It's basically a message for someone who's not a Jew or a Muslim, an Arab, or whatever, who's visiting. Don't come back again. Otherwise, every single time you'll have to face this, or even worse. So. Which is why, even Israeli society, I didn't have kind of much of it because we were visiting largely the West Bank. It was an interfaith solidarity group that had gone. So, but I think that a lot of people don't know the kind of the internal dynamics that you kind of just outlined here of Israeli society. So that's why I really thought that would be useful. But just moving right along, Max, because taking care of time here. I did want you to talk about, we mentioned Iran in this context, in the context of the Arab NATO being formed by the U.S. and Israel to confront Iran. But Iran, as part of the larger, the U.S. kind of hybrid war, fifth generation war, maximum pressure policy on Iran as part of its broader regime change policy towards, say, Venezuela as well. The pressure that it's putting on China, and then leading up to what we can call the new Cold War. So if you can talk about kind of where is this stemming from right now, and in fact, the type of think tanks, many of them Gulf funded, as you correctly point out in many of your articles, that are openly kind of advocating these policies that are happening, and now that are literally not just impoverishing but killing people throughout these various countries. If you can speak a little bit about that.
Right. Well, when you mention hybrid war, I see three main modalities of hybrid warfare. One would be economic warfare, which is the most pernicious and damaging, I would say, to human life or to human rights on the earth. It appears that 1/3 of the planet is currently living under U.S. economic sanctions.
Wow.
These are unilateral. Wow. These are unilateral coercive measures. They're not passed through the UN. They are illegal under international law.
Absolutely.
And they're more aggressive than ever because what the Trump administration is doing is actually imposing secondary sanctions. So they actually will sanction any company as well as the country itself that does business with that country. So that's, I mean, that's something that the human rights groups here in Washington, what I would call the human rights industrial complex, doesn't talk about.
Right.
The most, I'd say the most severe human rights issue, in Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, they don't say anything about it. The second would be,
but they'll talk about the authoritarianism of the Maduro regime. So,
exactly,
right.
exactly. It's all they talk about. The authoritarianism of the Maduro regime is supplying food almost for free, along with sanitary kits for over 3 million families in Venezuela, and has also put 3 million families in completely free housing while we're having an eviction crisis here in the United States, and they're under brutal U.S. sanctions. So the second kind of mode of hybrid warfare is information warfare, which, you know, media guys like me and you would be very familiar with. And at the Gray Zone, we didn't get started. The website I edit, thegrayzone.com, and that's gray with an AY. We didn't get started to wage information warfare, but we find ourselves responding to it so much. You know, think tanks, leadership, intelligence officials, they plant stories in the legitimate mainstream media. It's unscrutinized by journalists. They don't double check to see if this is legitimate, because often those journalists function as just kind of de facto agents of the intelligence agencies themselves.
Right. And they rely, of course, on official sources, unnamed official sources, but
right. It's like if you have a patient in a coma and they're hooked up to a feeding tube and you just take that tube away, you'll just watch them slowly die. That's what most journalists here in Washington would be like if you took away their intelligence sources. So they're not going to upset the intelligence agencies by actually reporting on what they're doing. And the third most obvious mode of hybrid warfare is unconventional warfare, like arming the moderate rebels in Syria who turn out to be Salafi jihadi extremists who exterminate.
I'm so glad you brought that. I'm sorry, Max. But before we get to our last section about America, so before I have to tell you this, because you probably have heard it at least 1 billion times by now, but we're inviting Max Blumenthal, this Assadist apologist, on the show. I was like, well, we can ask Max what his views are on the Assad regime and what happened in Syria, and let's hear him out. But of course, this is, I mean, you know much better than I do that. I mean, along the lines of kind of I mean, perhaps even more so, as our friend Asad Abu Khalil, the angry Arab, says, even more so than the Zionist propaganda in the United States on the question of Israel-Palestine, on the propaganda that we were subject to during this Syria crisis was just immense. I think you'd agree with me on that, and I think that very few individuals, including yourself, were kind of able to kind of consistently respond to this, yet also constantly be under attack. And just be termed Assadists, you know, apologists, and so on and so forth. So I'm glad you kind of raised the moderate rebels and Syria. So just a quick kind of some insights from you on that whole fiasco. So
this was state propaganda. We just published a piece based on leaked documents at the Gray Zone showing that virtually everything you saw and heard from Syria was the product of public relations agencies working with agents on the ground in areas held by the so-called moderate rebels. And these PR agencies were funded by the British Foreign Office and the US State Department. And then they catapulted the propaganda through US media, which was friendly to the message. And so it left sort of isolated voices like me or Asad Abu Khalil, who you mentioned before. And there were many others. And then we came in for harsh attack. And, you know, from my perspective as an American, it was really the post 9/11 era, the phony war on terror and the invasion of Iraq that galvanized my desire to do journalism. And I saw all of the propaganda constructs that were deployed around Iraq. the use of satellite imagery to show that there were mobile weapons of mass destruction labs. It all turned out to be fake. But one thing, the war in Iraq, it didn't really boast the kind of humanitarian, heartstring pulling, human rights propaganda that the Syrian conflict had. The Syrian conflict was also a proxy war where the U.S. was working along with its Gulf allies through proxy forces. So there weren't U.S. soldiers there coming back in body bags. So it was harder for people to understand in the United States. And they tended to, Assad was, and the Syrian government was portrayed as just this, it was this one-sided slaughter where they were massacring people just for fun. And all those people were doing was just protesting in the street. I mean, you didn't see the city of Idlib get overrun by the most fanatical forces on the planet, who then proceeded to force the Druze population to dig up their graves because they were not buried according to proper religious ritual, or be shot. They didn't force you didn't see in the US the entire Christian population be killed or forced to leave or convert. You didn't see women executed in the streets for committing adultery. You didn't see the women being punished and brutalized for wearing colorful hijab. You didn't see music being outlawed. You didn't see the graffiti all over the streets celebrating Ayman Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda globally, who actually visited Idlib at one point. You never saw any of that in US media. You just saw the big bad Assad. And, when I was able to go to Damascus, I saw an entire population of millions of people in one of the proudest Arab cities on the earth telling me about how their city was surrounded for years with mortars flying in from Saudi proxy forces like Jaish al-Islam. And I went into the areas that were controlled by these proxy forces and interviewed very humble people who told me that at first they thought that, this was a revolution, and then they were held hostage for years, and they watched their neighbors were raped and slaughtered for trying to resist the Jaish al-Islam forces stealing humanitarian aid and basically imprisoning everyone. So this was a disaster for Syria. The disaster continues 9.5 years later with US forces controlling Syrian oil fields in northeastern Syria, with wheat fields being burned by the US proxy force of the Syrian Democratic Forces, who are Kurdish. There is no oil or bread in major Syrian cities now because of brutal US sanctions that were passed with under humanitarian auspices. And you hear nothing about any of this, about the hospitals not having dialysis machines, about children being deprived of cancer drugs. No one being, the hospitals are unable to get catheters and these kinds of medical devices. And it's all because of sanctions. And the people who demonized us as Assad apologists have nothing to say about this. It turns out they don't care about the Syrian people at all. All they cared about was power for themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so ridiculous, Max, that you'll often hear the claim that, okay, well, if you're not supporting the so-called moderate rebels, the Syrian resistance, etc., is it because you're Islamophobic? So does it make one Islamophobic if one doesn't support Al-Qaeda? I mean, we were the ones that were expected to denounce and condemn every Al-Qaeda act that took place. And now all of a sudden, we Muslims are expected to support these forces. Otherwise we're Islamophobic, or whether we're Muslim or non-Muslim, we're Islamophobic if we're not supporting. I mean, this is a country where I tell people there wasn't a hint of Wahhabism, Salafism in Syria. Whatever horrible things you want to say about the Assad, and there are many about the political authoritarianism and so on of the Assad regime. This is clearly an area where that does not apply, as you were saying, in terms of kind of interreligious, kind of that type of pluralism. Assad didn't have any issue with that type of thing. And so, this was just the way the propaganda industry manipulated the discourse on this and portrayed individuals like yourselves or anyone else as almost being an Islamophobe for not supporting the quote unquote moderate Al Qaeda rebels that are trying to fight. I mean, it was just ridiculous how the whole thing was framed. But I'm glad you went over that very quickly. So I mean, folks can certainly read the incredible amount that you've written debunking all of the kind of the lies and fabrications told about the whole Syrian narrative. But I did want to move, Max, to our final topic, and that is, of course, what's going on in the United States right now. That is of concern of course, people here in Pakistan, but of course, people all over the world, Americans. What's going on in the U.S. What is Trump going to do? Of course, this is whether you think you like Trump, you don't like Trump for his domestic policies, foreign policies, that all of these things, regardless of that, there is a real concern right now that there's something different going on in the U.S. political culture right now, in the political system leading up to the elections that is somewhat concerning or causing anxiety. I mean, what are the kind of salient features right now in American political life that you want to maybe highlight, Max?
Well, you have pandemic, which the U.S. has been unable to figure out, and the country socially is in chaos. The social fabric is coming apart more rapidly than it has at probably any point in my life. It's like the economic crisis of 2008, 2009, but on steroids. And
right.
This is, led to anxiety on the right and what passes for the left in the US. And you have a president who is catering to the most extreme elements of his base, all the way to like the Nazi right, in order to build up enthusiasm. And he's banking on winning by enthusiasm. So in American cities, including in Washington, D.C., since this summer, there's been sort of a small scale rebellion against police violence. And police violence is just a constant factor of American life. I've experienced it myself. I mean, police are just like a roving gang here that can just terrorize anyone they want. And so a black man was murdered on camera. He was stepped on, his neck was stepped on. He was strangled. It took like 10 minutes. It was like an execution film. And people just came out into the streets at a time when they were not supposed to be in the streets. They were being kept at home. The economy was falling apart. And it just kind of became this giant ventilation mechanism for a lot of people. The Democrats wanted to shift it into an anti-Trump rebellion, but after their kind of middle-class Democrat population went home after a few days, the more hardcore elements of the radical left stayed in the streets, and they're still out there. And they've been battling police night after night in cities from Portland to Washington, D.C., to New York City. And the police are getting more and more violent. And Trump is trying to lean on this because the economy was going to be what his campaign was going to be about. The economy was doing very well for rich people and upper middle class people before the pandemic. Everybody else had to work like 3 jobs, but Trump was the record low unemployment. Like there was like 5%, 3% unemployment. It was true, but it was because so many people were working bad jobs, driving Uber, and so that went away. So all Trump has is his law and order campaign, and that has made the atmosphere much more frenetic and filled with anxiety. And it's made the kind of middle class coastal liberals who comprise the Democratic Party base more extreme in their own way. And every day they have a new, anti-Trump freak out driven by the news cycle. Yesterday was about Trump's taxes. Before that, it was about something to do with Russia, or, Trump saying he would. Oh,
Russia, you mentioned it. Oh, yeah. We don't have much time for it, but is Russia going to be involved again in this upcoming election?
Well, great question. I mean, we were told that Russia was going to hack the election again, and that seems to have faded away. And what's so interesting is that we were bombarded with anti-Russia propaganda, I think because, there were elements in the intelligence apparatus that just wanted to sell the public on a new Cold War.
Absolutely.
And, the Hillary Clinton dead enders wanted to explain away their loss by blaming Vladimir Putin and WikiLeaks for exposing what their real corruption was. But basically, we heard nonstop Russiagate, Trump-Russia collusion. It was never proven. They had a giant investigation in the Senate. It didn't prove what the Democrats had hoped. And then they tried to impeach the president because he wouldn't authorize an arms deal to Ukraine, and there was a quid pro quo. And if you were here in the US and you watched like network news or the cable news, it was just nonstop coverage of this boring impeachment hearing that no one could understand, with these anonymous figures coming out of the diplomatic corps to say that Trump, a gangster. And then when Democrats have their convention to make their case to the American public, the impeachment hearings were not mentioned once. Trump-Russia collusion was barely mentioned at all. And we're hearing next to nothing about it. And Trump's taxes show no money from Russia. The public that's going to swing the election, who are just regular working American people, don't care about any of this Russia stuff or this foreign. And the Democrats,
or that all roads lead to Putin.
All roads lead to Putin, right? I mean, for most people, all roads lead to like their third job, and like
exactly
to pay for like
sometimes I think to myself, Max, that Putin must be very jealous right now. That why is the Trump and everyone else blaming China and Xi Jinping for the coronavirus? Why doesn't Putin get the credit for letting out the coronavirus? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know Putin. I don't know anyone remotely connected to him, but I imagine that he didn't mind being built up by this narrative into this global Dr. Evil.
Exactly. Right.
And the focus now is increasingly turning to China, which is interesting because the Russiagate divided people along partisan lines. The Republicans were able to resist it in a somewhat effective way. And, we have Aaron Mate as my colleague at the Gray Zone.
Yes.
He's been like a human buzzsaw, just ripping through the narrative of Russiagate. And I know that, a lot of the Republicans follow him and don't understand he's a leftist. He's not with them on any other issues. But when it comes to China, there's a new alliance that's forming that I would call like a blue-brown alliance between the center-left Democrats and even some kind of self-styled progressive forces in the U.S. and the Bannonite far right, and of course the neocons on China, and they're uniting. They're uniting against what they fear is a country that will supersede American empire and will take over the world. And and you hear this on the progressive left, that China and the Communist Party of China will actually take over the world and dominate us. And you hear constantly about Hollywood having to censor itself for China, and Chinese spies in New York, Chinese students spying on campus here. It's really overtaken Russiagate, but it's not really about a candidate. It's just an all-encompassing fear that I think will dictate American foreign policy and dominate American life for at least the next decade.
No, absolutely. And you're absolutely right when you say that kind of this motley alliance of these various forces. I mean, we have to remember that the quote unquote pivot to Asia began under Obama. Obama understood very well that, basically in the Middle East, nothing was being accomplished but other than chaos and so forth. And he said that, there was a recognition right from then that actually these are going to be the powers, the rising powers that actually we have to deal with. And so you're absolutely right. I mean, the liberals, just as much as the conservatives and the neoconservatives, have recognized very clearly that we have to deal with the rise of China, whether it really is a threat or not. It doesn't matter, but we must confront it. But Max, I did want to ask you on the last point. I'm not. Well, one I did want to ask you. So, who do you think is going to win in November? That I did want to ask as well. But I also wanted to ask you about this question that has been coming up now these days, about Trump consistently kind of dodging the question of whether he would, in the event that he is defeated, that he would concede defeat and leave office, etc., and that we may have some type of a civil war situation, and what would happen then. So if we can end on this very pleasant note, of, of, of how do you see things unfolding? And again, the polls and all of this stuff, we know how much we should take those seriously from the last election. But I want your kind of insights into kind of what you see in your magic crystal ball over the next few months, particularly around these elections.
Well, the Democratic campaign for the presidency through Biden has been the most pathetic. And I mean, they've run many pathetic, horrible campaigns. This is the most pathetic. They're basically banking on the fact that most American voters, which is not necessarily most Americans, would vote for a dirty diaper over Donald Trump. And that may be true. I would have said that, if the pandemic hadn't hit, that Donald Trump might have won because the economy would have been doing fairly well. And at least he would have been able to sell it that way. But now Trump is increasingly reduced to his base. And the Democrats are taking for granted that this is just a referendum on Donald Trump. I think all the major political observers, all the bettors, Las Vegas, are betting against Donald Trump this time. But remember that the polls showed Donald Trump way behind Hillary Clinton in 2016. The Trump campaign works. They don't work through traditional institutions like the media. The debate is coming up tomorrow. It's not going to be as important as people think. One thing Donald Trump is doing that very few American political observers understand is he's working through one of the most important institutions for American males, which is college football. And it had been shut down, which means that a lot of American males were freaking out. I mean, the thing that their lives revolved around, that gave them their identity, wasn't there. And so Donald Trump starts pushing, working with these right-wing media personalities for the Big Ten Conference, which is all of the major Midwestern states, to open up. And Wisconsin, Michigan, if Donald Trump wins those states, he wins the election. And Donald Trump will then take credit for giving Americans back their football games. And these are people that often don't vote. So Donald Trump has a very clever strategy, and he can't be underestimated. But the Biden campaign, I mean, if you pay attention to U.S. media right now, the New York Times or CNN or any major media institution, corporate media institution, it feels like the Biden re-election campaign. I mean, they're just campaigning for Biden openly. And every message that Americans are deluged with right now, if you go on to any social media platform, or there's a platform called Yelp where you look for restaurants, and it immediately a pop-up ad will come up that tells you to vote. And what they mean is vote Biden. So, but they can't say Biden because no one cares about Biden. No one's inspired by him. So it's just vote, and vote against Trump, and everything will be fine. So I wouldn't make a prediction, but I would say, conventional wisdom is that Trump will lose because of the economy, because of him infuriating too many established institutions. But that was also the conventional wisdom in 2016. Right.
And any thoughts on what may happen if he is defeated? I mean, do you really think that his claims, or that other people, what they are anticipating, someone like Chomsky has even said that, look, if this guy really doesn't leave, they're going to have to take him out by force and this type of thing. And
I know that to me is another. I mean, I mentioned before that the liberals and the Democratic base, every day they come up with a new freak out in order to motivate people. And this is just part of that narrative. Donald Trump, what he's saying is very similar to
Yeah.
what Hillary Clinton has said about what Joe Biden should do. And in fact, the Democrats have created a commission called like the Transition Commission or something like that to manage what happens if all of the votes are not counted by election day and the election isn't decided and Donald Trump claims credit for victory. Because of the pandemic and people being stuck at home and the older population that votes in higher numbers than younger people here, there will be mail-in ballots. They may not be able to count it. And what Donald Trump was saying is, I don't think the results will be in on election night. And so I'm going to, wait and see. And I think that would be wise for Joe Biden too. And the funny thing is in 2000, the election was stolen by George W. Bush. A recount was stopped and Al Gore, being the establishment guy that he was, who had been raised to be president since he was a boy, just conceded. The election was completely stolen from him and decided by the Supreme Court. It was the most undemocratic election in modern times. He should not have conceded. So
absolutely.
And I could see the candidates fighting out, but do I think like nice middle-class liberals who, put tolerance signs on their cars are going to go out and riot in the streets and burn the country down? Do I think that if the military comes and tells Donald Trump, sir, you have to leave, that he's going to have his far right militias in the streets attacking, the police and the military? I don't think that's going to happen. But I do think it's going to be a very unusual election. And, but I wouldn't like overhype this Civil War narrative. I think there are a lot of people in the media who would like to see something like that take place.
But,
like they love to see wars take place elsewhere, and they love to see regime change operations and coups. They'd be happy to cover that at home.
That's right. Absolutely. Unfortunately, Max, we're out of time now, but I would really love maybe post-election time, maybe early next year, see how once again Russia's influence and Putin's influence and his moderating influence on American politics, how that happens next year. But no, Max, this was an absolute delight to have you finally and to engage with you on these issues. I know it was we touched a lot of things, and probably I did a disservice to you, not giving you sufficient time in addressing them. But I really do anticipate having more of these discussions with you in the future. But thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks a lot, Junaid. I had a great time.
Thanks, Max. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.